going to, even though it's a smallish group, more like a seminar, we thought we'd use the lectern partly because it's an easier way to record, and all of our events are on our website and are available to watch and to listen. I'm Sunil Kilnani. I'm the director of the India Institute here at King's. And at the India Institute, we have the Tagore Center for Global Thought, which is generously supported by the Indian Ministry of Culture. And it bears the name of Tagore, but its mission and its job really is to take many of the ideas and spirit of Tagore, but to look at his that ethos, if you like, in a variety of different other contexts. So it's not just focused on Tagore's own thoughts and writings, but on some of the arguments, debates, and ideas that would have interested a mind such as Tagore's. It's really to explore the spirit of his thinking. And in that connection, I think there really isn't a better person to speak to us this evening than Professor Jonardon Ganeri. Jonardon actually has a strong connection with King's. He studied here, and I'm very pleased to know, will be back as a visiting professor in the philosophy department in coming times. So, and I hope he will also be associated with, in some ways, with the India Institute and some of our activities in an area that we really want to be doing more. He is well known, I think, to all of you, and certainly to those in the world of philosophy and intellectual history, as one of the most interesting minds today, trying to connect developments in Indian thought and Indian philosophy and broader European and Western traditions of thinking. He's written a vast amount, not just journals and articles in philosophy reviews, but also many books. His most recent books are the Self, Naturalism, Consciousness, and the First Person Stance, a book really of very serious and difficult philosophy, certainly for an amateur such as I. But he's also published The Lost Age of Reason, Philosophy in Early Modern India, which is more in some ways a piece of intellectual history, and I think a really, really stimulating set of arguments that he makes in that book. He's going to speak tonight about a very important but somewhat unknown, or certainly underknown, figure in Indian intellectual history, Krishna Chandra Bhattacharya, who wrote a very powerful short text, actually it was a lecture in the 1920s, which took off from Gandhi's ideas about svarāj, self-rule, but extended them to the realm of thought and to the realm of ideas, and indeed his lecture was called Svarāj and Ideas. And it's a quite explosive lecture, which has sort of from time to time surfaced in Indian debates in very rich and productive ways. So without further delay, I'll ask Jonardon to start his lecture. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Sunil, and thank you everyone for coming. To connect my talk today with Tagore, since we're hosted by the Tagore Center, I just wanted to read something that I was reminded in Sunil's book, The Idea of India, that Isaiah Berlin said about Tagore, which was that Tagore never showed his wisdom more clearly than in choosing the difficult middle path, drifting neither to the Scylla of radical modernism nor to the Charybdis of proud and gloomy traditionalism. He looked for a middle path between traditionalism and modernism. And really that's what the figure I'm going to talk about today, Krishna Chandra Bhattacharya, was also trying to do in this essay that Sunil has just mentioned. So the aim of this essay is to reclaim the legacy of Bhattacharya as a kind of cosmopolitan thinker and to defend him against the criticism that he was a traditionalist. So in fact, I think very far from being a traditionalist, he was a profoundly cosmopolitan thinker in a new kind of way. At a time when calls for India's political independence from British colonial rule were gathering momentum, the philosopher Krishna Chandra Bhattacharya issued a plea for freedom from what he called cultural subjection, a deeply insidious and almost invisible intellectual slavery. Cultural subjection, he said, is ordinarily of an unconscious character, and it implies slavery from the very start. There is cultural subjection only when one's traditional cast of ideas and sentiments is superseded without comparison or competition by a new cast representing an alien culture which possesses one like a ghost. He's of course talking about British colonial rule and the imposition of a British system of education in India. The sources of subjection for Bhattacharya lie not in the fact that the new culture is alien, but that it has been allowed to supersede without comparison or competition. For Bhattacharya is precise that, continued the quotation, assimilation need not be an evil. It may be positively necessary for healthy progress. And in any case, it does not mean a lapse of freedom. Assimilation is not a mere patchwork of ideas of different cultures, nor a hybridization of ideas, but consists in that synthesis or adjustment or adaptation in which the foreign ideal is assimilated to our ideal and not the other way around. For, Bhattacharya goes on, it's wrong not to accept an ideal that is felt to be a simpler and deeper expression of one's own ideas simply because it hails from a foreign country. The acceptance of such an ideal is really no surrender of individuality. To serve this foreign God is to serve our own God. The foreign ideal is here our own ideal. So assimilation, in Bhattacharya's sense, is governed by a principle according to which the assimilated idea, even if alien in origin, is a simpler or deeper expression of an idea that is already one's own. Foreign ideas need to be treated with critical reserve and not docile acceptance. Docile acceptance without criticism would mean slavery. Quotation again. This sort of critical reception represents a rooted rationalism where, to continue the quotation, rationalism is here the efflux of reverence for the traditional institutions through which customary sentiments are deepened into transparent ideals. The only way to appraise a new ideal is to view it through our actual ideal. The only way to find a new reverence is to deepen our old reverence. Progress is not achieved by a detached reason judging between an old God and a new God. The way to know facts is not the way to know values. Let's finish the quotation. So rooted rationalism is the use of reason to appraise new values according to our actual values, and is fundamentally grounded in a reverence for tradition, which transforms normative intuitions into clear expressions of a system of value. For normative concepts, he says, have the distinctive character of the particular culture to which they belong, and new norms or values should be appraised as metaphors and symbols to be translated into our own indigenous concepts. Rooted rationalism means deciding whether or not to accept a new idea only after one has translated that idea into one's own concepts. Bhattacharya contrasts this use of reason with one that is a merely mechanical separation, in his phrase, based on subjective preference, the accidental likes and dislikes of the person judging, without any imaginative effort to realize them in an attitude of humility. And he associates what we might call mechanical rationality with mathematics and the natural sciences as distinct from normative investigation or the valuation of ideals. There are thus two kinds of rationality, one based on humility combined with imagination, the other a more detached form of cleverness. That's a kind of summary of the content of svarāj and ideas. Now, it's notoriously difficult to identify the influences Bhattacharya draws on in his eclectic and creative writings, but I want to point out two affinities in the above discussion. The first is with the analysis of development and corruption of traditions in the work of John H. Newman. Newman argues that it's a sign of healthy development and not of corruption for a tradition to assimilate ideas from the outside and to anticipate its own development. There's no corruption, he says, if the idea retains one and the same type, the same principles, the same organization, if its beginnings anticipate its subsequent phases, and its later phenomena protect and subserve its earlier. If it has a power of assimilation and revival, he too uses the word assimilation, and a vigorous action from first to last. Healthy traditions are not insular, rather they're able to absorb and assimilate external influences. The reason is surety in their inner principles, which are then brought into relationship with ideas from outside the tradition. Outside influences do not corrupt a healthy tradition, but rather assist it in its development. That an idea more readily coalesces with these ideas rather than those, he says, does not show that it has been unduly influenced, that is corrupted by them, but that it has an antecedent affinity with them. So a dynamic tradition finds in the wider social environment a rich source of nutrition from which it draws strength in the process of perfecting its internal principles. The stronger and more living is an idea, he says, that is, the more powerful hold it exercises on the minds of men, the more able it is to dispense with safeguards and trust itself against the danger of corruption. It becomes more confident, self-confident. The idea that a healthy tradition is robust enough to assimilate ideas that support its development, according to the inner principles of its ideals, in a spirit of neither docile acceptance nor of uncritical rejection, is, I think, fully in accord with Bhattacharya's notion of reverence. In the distinction he makes between such culturally rooted rationality and the mechanical rationality of the natural sciences, Bhattacharya is, I think, clearly drawing on, this is the second influence I want to try and highlight, a classical Indian distinction between two types of reason. An important contrast within mainstream Hinduism is reflected in the differential use of the terms hetu, evidence-based rationality, and tarka, suppositional rationality. Manu, the author of the most influential of the law books, the Manusmriti, is unequivocal in his criticism of the unrooted use of evidence-based reason. He said, if a twice-born disparages these two, namely the Veda and the law, the Dhamma-shastra, by relying on the science of evidence-based reasoning, hetu shastra, he ought to be ostracized by good people as an infidel and a denigrator of the Veda. But what's overlooked in the standard criticism of Manu as an orthodox and traditional thinker is the fact that he is considerably more willing to allow a place for a distinctive type of reasoning, suppositional rationality. He says, right at the end of the book, the man who scrutinizes the record of the seers and the teachings of the law by means of suppositional reasoning, tarka, not inconsistent with the Vedic treatise, he alone knows the law and no one else. This distinction between hetu and tarka seems close to the one Bhattacharya draws on between mechanical and rooted rationality. Just as Manu argues that the violence endorsed in the Veda can be criticized only on the basis of norms about the use of violence in the Vedas themselves, so Bhattacharya says that to accept the Western criticism of the caste system is to, quote, ignore the fact that we who have received Western education constitute a caste more exclusive and intolerant than any of the traditional castes. A true independence in thought, he concludes, is a return to what he calls the cultural stratum of the real Indian people. Bhattacharya situates rooted rationalism between docile acquiescence on the one side and scientific reason on the other. In the sphere of philosophy, the rooted rationalist is the philosopher who both displays reverence for the Indian philosophical tradition and appraises ideas in Western philosophy from the standpoint of classical Indian theory. In 1936, some 5 years after giving the lecture Svarāj in Ideas, Bhattacharya inherited from Sarvepalli Radhakrishnan, the King George V Chair of Mental and Moral Science at the University of Calcutta. Radhakrishnan himself leaving to take up the Spalding Chair in Eastern Religions and Ethics at All Souls College, and later the Vice Presidency and then the Presidency of India. Radhakrishnan too expressed a disdain for the mechanical use of reason, but fails to draw the distinction Bhattacharya does between it and a rooted rationalism that allows for healthy assimilation. The whole course of Hindu philosophy, Radhakrishnan declares, is a continuous affirmation of the truth that insight into reality does not come through analytical intellect. The aspiration of a return to Indian tradition is, he says, to wean us moderns from too exclusive preoccupation with secular life or the temporary formulations in which logical thought has too often sought to imprison spiritual aspirations. That, for Bhattacharya, would be a rooted irrationalism, for the uncritical acceptance of one's own tradition is no better than that of a foreign one. It is perhaps Bimal Krishna Motilal, the next but one occupant of the Spalding Chair, rather than Radhakrishnan, who most fully embodies the ideal of rooted rationalism. Motilal's reverence for the Indian tradition lies in his deep intellectual engagement with that tradition's philosophical theory, articulated in his conviction that it cannot be left out of any serious history of philosophy. Motilal carefully read carefully and sympathetically the work of his Oxford colleagues, who were then among the leading philosophers in the world. But his appraisal of their views comes from his deep engagement with India, and there is both acceptance of their ideas and rejection of them on the basis of a translation of them into the terms of an Indian philosophical stance, specifically for him the Pramana-Prameya framework. The philosophy he presents, which he calls Nyaya realism, is a deeply engaged interpretation of the Nyaya tradition, conducted with imagination and humility, and unafraid to assimilate ideas from Strawson, Dummett, and other Western thinkers, insofar as they help him to construct a strong rational defense. And it was therefore quite unjust and actually rather offensive for Wilhelm Habfast to accuse Motilal of judging Indian philosophy by Western norms. Habfast's allegation that Motilal uses Western analytical philosophy as, in his terms, a standard of evaluation and as a measure of Indian thought, quite fundamentally misunderstands Motilal's philosophical enterprise. Motilal's writings being replete with occasions when it's the Indian voice which criticizes the Western one. In offering his criticism, Habfast was, perhaps unwittingly, accusing Motilal of precisely the cultural subjection Bhattacharya cautioned against. And it's not only unthinkable that Motilal could be insensitive to a danger forewarned by the most prominent Indian philosopher of the age decades before, but also ironic that should come from a European Orientalist. Whatever Bhattacharya meant by reverence, and I have still to clarify the concept. It cannot be the clinically detached objectivity, the mechanical rationality of the Orientalist scholar. As a tool in the project of conceptual decolonization, Bhattacharya's invocation of a concept of cultural reverence aims to respect the integrity of tradition. What distinguishes his thought from mere traditionalism is the counterbalancing role of the notion of assimilation or accommodation, a measured openness to diverse cultural influence. The intellectual stance he would seem to advocate in Svarāj and Ideas is more or less the one which Samuel Scheffler describes as traditionalism with a cosmopolitan inflection, in his famous paper on different notions of cosmopolitanism. That is to say, a traditionalism in which, to quote Scheffler, affords a model of traditional engagement that incorporates the central insight of cosmopolitanism about culture, namely the receptiveness to cultural innovation. Those whose traditionalism takes this form, Scheffler goes on, will think it important to identify and perpetuate the values and practices on whose continuity the integrity of their traditions rest. At the same time, they'll be prepared to reconcile those elements of the tradition that are no longer credible as they stand, but which admit of illuminating reinterpretation, to abandon elements of the tradition that have come to seem unacceptable and which resist reinterpretation, and to promote the intelligent selection and incorporation into the tradition of new ideas and practices whose inspiration may be drawn from external sources, but which can be embraced without doing violence to the integrity of the tradition and can instead serve to enrich it. The ideal of cosmopolitanism, as Ulf Hanertz put it, is an orientation, a willingness to engage the other, an intellectual and aesthetic stance of openness towards divergent cultural experiences. Rabindranath Tagore articulated a cosmopolitan vision of intercultural encounter, which he termed contextual universalism, when he said that, I quote, peoples, being living personalities, must have their self-expression, and this leads to their distinctive creations. They are like different dishes at one common feast. They add richness to our enjoyment and understanding of truth. They are making the world of man fertile of life and variedly beautiful. There are two thoughts there in that quotation from Tagore. One is that the savouring of another's culture is a kind of aesthetic enlargement, just as we're enlarged by encounters with great works of art. The second thought is that intercultural encounter is a sort of cognitive nutrition, the route to a balanced intellectual diet and health of mind, a precondition for any truth-directed inquiry. As the Sanskrit grammarian Bhattacharya already knew many moons ago, insight attains clarity through the study of diverse traditional views. I now want to consider how Bhattacharya's views expressed in this essay were received in post-independence India. The viability of a rooted rationalism hinges on the meaning and significance of the concept of reverence. Philosophers in India after independence understood the concept to imply or consist in deference and traditionalism and rejected it. A.P. Rao, writing in 1977, provides a withering denunciation of Bhattacharya's appeal to indigenous tradition and indeed of the spirit of reverence and assimilation that informed the Indian Renaissance. I quote his incomparable writing. Contemporary Indian intellectuals are intrinsically incapable of living without inheritance, he says. They're equally incapable of being unique. They have two tremendous psychic necessities. These are first to invoke the 3 millennia old native tradition to delude themselves and others into the belief that they are very much in its sphere, and secondly to deceive themselves and others into the conviction that the 2 millennia old European tradition intersects the native one precisely at the point where they stand. Their entire eschatological lucuberation is about the point of intersection and their locus there. This is my succinct summary of the spiritual exegesis of contemporary Indian philosophers writing on their counterparts of a bygone age. However, on occasional but momentary return to normalcy, these philosophers become aware of their self-identity. And that's how, by now, it's become part of our conventional and collective wisdom that this sort of exegesis is symptomatic of our coolie complex, which we developed when we were subjects. Now that we've become citizens, the question is, what is to be done? Rooted rationality, Rao seems to be saying, is just another facet of cultural subjection. It's a pretension today for an intellectual to imagine that they belong to an ancient tradition, an arrogance to assume that they are located at the unique point in history where two great civilizational streams meet. Rao claims that rootedness is based on a new antinomy of reason. He says, there's no specific name for this type of argument in the extant logical literature. Nevertheless, it's a fallacy, and it is typical of colonial intellectuals. To capture the formal structure of that argument, relativizing it to the present context, I may venture to state that it reads like, if foreign Plato could do it, then Deshi Shankara must have done it. Plato did it, so Shankara did it. A syllogism. Now one can see another line of critique in the responses to Bhattacharya commissioned for a special issue of the Indian Philosophical Quarterly by the guest editors K.J. Shah, Ramchandra Gandhi, Sharad Deshpande, and Prabal Dasgupta in 1984. By and large, the respondents see themselves as having achieved autonomy from tradition and resent Bhattacharya's pre-description of them as mechanical rationalists. Prasad makes the telling point that one's own tradition can be just as enslaving as a foreign one. Any tradition can dominate an individual, he says, and even an indigenous one can dominate him to the extent of destroying or very greatly weakening his judgmental decision-making ability, his ability to think freely, objectively, and dispassionately. If such a thing happens, it will be nothing less than the annihilation, or at least the suppression, of svarāj and ideas. Indeed, an indigenous tradition is all the more likely to insinuate itself in such a way that one fails to notice, to possess one as a ghost. So Prasad says that Bhattacharya does not realize that it's more difficult to emancipate oneself from the domination by indigenous tradition than from that by an alien one. So the post-independence philosopher reaches for autonomy not just from the domination of foreign intellectual traditions, but from all forms of tradition. Autonomy consists in the ability to think for oneself independently of any tradition. Daya Krishna summarizes the new mentality when he says that svarāj and ideas can only be achieved by radical alteration in our attitude to both the traditions, the Indian and the Western. We have to de-identify with both and treat them only as take-off points for our own thinking, which should be concerned with what we consider important. We see in that quote all three key themes in the new mentality: the rejection of Bhattacharya's notion of reverence in favor of de-identification, The idea that the philosopher's own sense of what is of importance is the fundamental norm against which to appraise cultural tradition, and the denial there is any important difference between traditions that are one's own and traditions that are alien. For the same reason, the post-colonial Indian philosopher has lost any anxiety about the use of English as a language of communication, and is not worried that its use is another modality of foreign domination. English is used with mastery and panache, and has itself already been colonized by Indian writers. Thus, R.K. Narayan as a novelist is unmistakably Indian, though he writes in English. The same could be said, of course, of Tagore and even of Bhattacharya himself. These thinkers have an effortless fluency in English that seems in no way to inhibit their Indian creativity. So the post-independence Indian philosopher is acutely aware that traditions, especially one's own, need to be subjected to internal criticism and review. The trope of accommodation needs to be supplemented with one of modification, for as Hiran Gohain puts it, what Bhattacharya does not say is that it may be both possible and desirable to modify our existing heritage in the light of the achievements of other cultures. Unless this is admitted, a self-critical review of our own intellectual habits and cultural ideas becomes impossible. Indeed, I fear such an attitude may perpetuate inherited injustice and inhumanity. Yet those philosophers who affirm their autonomy from all tradition find even this notion of modification to be incoherent. A.K. Rao again puts it like this. He says, one cannot mend his torn trousers an infinite number of times. Someday he will either have to go for a new pair or else without them. The post-independence experience is thus one of pushing away tradition, resisting the return to one's own tradition as a counterweight to colonial domination, in favour of an entitlement to criticise inherited tradition and foreign tradition alike according to one's own judgment. And such judgment is not merely a matter of personal likes and dislikes, as Bhattacharya insinuates, but is capable of objectivity, maturity, and insightfulness. These philosophers interpret the notion of reverence for one's own tradition as implying a new subjection and loss of autonomy, and instead, from their own preoccupation with a rarefied notion of intellectual freedom, rehabilitate unrooted rationality as the truly autonomous exercise of reason. The idea might be understood in terms of a distinction Scheffler draws between what he calls moderate and extreme interpretations of cosmopolitanism. What both variants have in common is a recognition, Scheffler says, that individuals have the capacity to flourish by forging idiosyncratic identities from heterogeneous cultural sources, and are not to be thought of as constituted or defined by ascriptive ties to a particular culture, community, or tradition. Such a life, he quotes Salman Rushdie as putting it, celebrates hybridity, impurity, intermingling, the transformation that comes of new and unexpected combinations of human beings, cultures, ideas, politics, movie songs. It rejoices in mongrelization and fears the absolutism of the pure. Melange, hodgepodge, a bit of this and a bit of that is how newness enters the world. Where the moderate and the extreme cosmopolitans differ is in the answer they give to the question whether those who do not forge idiosyncratic identities from heterogeneous cultural materials, but whose aims and aspirations are structured instead by the values and traditions of a particular cultural community, are deemed just as capable as flourishing as people who are culturally more adventurous. In other words, it's the question whether any special responsibilities one might have to one particular cultural community autonomously coexist side by side a cosmopolitan commitment, or are legitimate only insofar as they can be derived from it. Post-coloniality amongst India's philosophers expressed itself in an extreme cosmopolitanism, the very possibility of which they felt threatened by traditionalism, even with a cosmopolitan inflection. The attempt to combine reverence and reserve is the distinctive trait of a moderate cosmopolitan thinker. For Anthony Appiah, wrote a very famous book about cosmopolitanism, two strands are intertwined in the notion of cosmopolitanism. One strand is the idea that, as he puts it, we have obligations to others, obligations that stretch beyond those to whom we're related by the ties of kith and kin. But then the other strand is that, he says, we take seriously the value not just of human life, but of particular human lives, which means taking an interest in the practices and beliefs that lend them significance. People are different, the cosmopolitan knows, and there's much to learn from our differences. K C Bhattacharya is clearly against extreme cosmopolitanism, which he dismisses as merely a patchwork of ideas of different cultures. And yet it's unclear whether the optimistically have-it-all moderate cosmopolitanism of Appiah does represent a stable intellectual stance. What I want to claim is that Bhattacharya discovers a third way, an alternative to either hodgepodge or have-it-all, that is to say, extreme or moderate cosmopolitanisms. Water. So were the post-independence intellectuals right to view K C Bhattacharya as an enemy of cosmopolitanism? In his actual philosophical practice, Bhattacharya was a deeply original thinker. As even Prasad concedes, unquote, anyone who synthesizes Kant's doctrine of the autonomy or spontaneous freedom of the rational will with the witnessing consciousness, the Sakshi Chaitanya of the Advaita Vedanta, to get the doctrine of the self, the pure subject, as freedom, has done something creative. Bhattacharya's reverence for the traditional notion of witnessing consciousness has enabled him to deepen his sentiment that the rational will possesses spontaneity. Reverence is the attitude that enables him to see the Advaitic notion as an expression of his commitment to freedom. This can in no way be portrayed as a surrender of reason to tradition. As well as characterizing reverence as the deepening of sentiment, Bhattacharya describes it as an imaginative effort to realize ideas in an attitude of humility. Reverence is the active employment with humility of the philosophical imagination. Humility implies a respect for the wisdom and insight of the thinkers of the past, while imagination means taking up their thought in a spirit of creative philosophical engagement. I've actually argued elsewhere that this spirit of thinking with the ancients is the defining mark of a certain sort of modernity. And so in his actual philosophical practice, Bhattacharya is a distinctively modern thinker in the exact sense of the term. One explanation, of course, is that the view he articulates in Svarāj and Ideas, in that essay, is not a view he himself endorses, that he promotes it only as an effective instrumental means in the project of cultural decolonization, that his lecture was an exercise in upaya kaushalya, in skill and means. As such, though, it would have been extremely ineffective, since his own work was readily available to be read by his audience, and they would presumably have noticed that what he preached he did not practice. So I think a better strategy, and the one that I want to follow, is to let his actual philosophical use of the Indian tradition guide our interpretation of what the notion of reverence meant for him. To accuse Bhattacharya of traditionalism, moreover, seems to miss the biographical fact that he had earlier been passed over for the King George V chair at the University of Calcutta in 1921, many years before he actually got it, in favour of the much younger Radhakrishnan, a staunch supporter of Vivekananda and of a nativist return to Indian idealism, someone who nevertheless found favour in the British colonial establishment with a knighthood, an invitation to deliver the Gifford Lectures, membership of the British Academy, and eventually an Oxford chair. Bhattacharya could never aspire to such endorsement. He was simply too independent in his philosophical spirit to fit the expected profile of an Indian philosopher. Radhakrishnan's Kepleresque message that Indian philosophy is Indian philosophy and European philosophy is European philosophy threatened neither party. Bhattacharya's claim that India judges Europe did. The British could actually welcome Radhakrishnan's message that Indian thought has nothing to do with analysis, reason, and logic. What would irritate them is the arrogance of the claim that Kant is Sancho Panza to Shankara's Don Quixote. What drives the traditionalists to turn away from openness to cultural innovation is a sense of loss that, to quote Scheffler once more, when rich and vibrant traditions, practices, and ways of life are modified or supplanted through the emergence of new cultural combinations and social possibilities, one of the results may be the loss of entire social worlds with their particular rhythms, forms of beauty and achievement, and patterns of personal interaction, with their different ways of ordering human experiences so as to create distinctive modes of fulfillment, of solidarity, and of consolation. Yet Bhattacharya was open to the philosophy of European thinkers like Kant to an extraordinary degree, quite unlike the genuinely traditional Brahminical pundits who conserved the tradition and bemoaned its loss of purity. Reverence is an exhibition of reason, because one must use one's reason to select aspects of the tradition for imaginative engagement. To put the point metaphorically, it's not that one simply finds oneself with roots in the ancient tradition, but rather that one must actively plant oneself there. The activity of imagining with humility an ancient idea is a way of taking root in the tradition, and that's not passivity, but spontaneity. It's this aspect of Bhattacharya's notion of reverence that his post-independence critics missed in their accusation that he was siding with the traditionalists and the nativists. The guest editors of the special issue of the Indian Philosophical Quarterly devoted to Swaraj ideas indeed felt moved to say in a very terse editorial postscript that, to quote, "We should be utterly failing in our duty towards the text which inspires this special number and towards its sophisticated author if we did not here complainingly point out that at several places, in several pieces, KCB's Wittgenstein anticipating and structuralism enhancing plea for intellectual autonomy and rooted universalism has been lazily and fallaciously equated with throwback chauvinism and purblind patriotism." The suggestion that Bhattacharya's rooted rationalism has affinities with Wittgenstein and structuralism is regrettably never developed. But two other suggestions have been explored. Ranjan Ghosh, in a reappreciation of Svarāj ideas from 2001, provides a phenomenological reading of Bhattacharya's notion of reverence. He notes that Bhattacharya speaks more than once of inwardness, the inwardness of our traditional social structure, and the inwardness of our life. Ghosh uses this to provide a phenomenological reading of reverence as immersed engagement, he says. KCB therefore stresses the need for understanding the inwardness of the tradition. Indeed, such understanding would be, to my mind, of the kind that is applicable to a work of art rather than to a problem in logic or mathematics. Understanding a poem, for example, is not merely making sense of the words in it in a mechanical fashion, but rather feeling its inwardness or the emotive resonance. In other words, understanding the inwardness of the tradition would mean participating in it, and that should be considered quite different from viewing it from the outside. What's important here is to realize that merely a dry intellectual formulation of one's tradition is not enough for understanding it, unless it's duly backed up with the lived experiential content of its inwardness. This also gives one the freedom to creatively interpret one's own tradition. The interpretation of reverence as experiential immersion reveals that the concept is perfectly compatible with the sort of autonomy emphasized by the post-independence philosophers. The point that needs to be stressed, Ghosh continues, is that a living tradition is quite amenable to different interpretations, and for the individual to be able to freely work out such interpretations, regardless of domination from the state or other cultures, is to achieve a degree of svarāj in ideas. This does not mean that the individual must remain within the straitjacket of his tradition, as it has been understood or interpreted by others. Clearly, svarāj does not mean either traditionalism or isolationism. Far from it, svarāj, to my mind, is a call for the individual to participate in the tradition and interpret it in a creative spirit. End of quote. So reverence is here linked with notions of participation and interpretation. It's a form of engaged aesthetic appreciation. Those notions are consistent with Bhattacharya's talk of the use of tradition to deepen a sentiment and of the exercise of the imagination with humility. One's feel for the freedom of the subject is deepened through an appreciation of the notion of witness consciousness, gained by way of an immersed engagement in the Advaitic world. For a second reconstruction of Bhattacharya's notion of reverence, let's fast forward to the present day. The current director of the Indian Institute for Advanced Study in Shimla has appealed to the legacy of K C Bhattacharya to explain his vision as to what makes that institute distinct. Excuse me. His selected theme is what he calls the contemporization of the ethics. Referring to svarāj in ideas, Peter de Souza explains that, quote, one motivation to contemporize the ethics is driven by the desire to both avoid such cultural subjection and to develop within our own cultural world a temper of appreciation and criticism, humor and irony. When a society has developed and demonstrates many levels of appreciation, it's a marker of its intellectual autonomy. If it has also developed a capacity for irony, then one can read in that irony the self-confidence of that society. Well, here the notion of reverence is explicated in terms of a temper of appreciation and criticism, of humour and irony, where appreciation is linked not with subjection, but with intellectual autonomy, and irony is the hallmark of cultural self-confidence. In other words, we exercise freedom in the way we appreciate the tradition, in this case the Indian epics, and we display self-confidence in the way we hold it at an ironic distance. The combination of appreciation and distance, critical or ironic, is characteristic of a new type of philosophy, diasporic. We might call it diasporic philosophy. For it's especially in diasporic communities that one finds the signal combination of deep reverence for the traditions of the home country, and as a natural consequence of one's location elsewhere, where elsewhere might be in terms of geography or history, or in the modern intellectual lives in a kind of internal diasporic relation with the ancient tradition. The autonomy so prized by the post-independence thinker is not relinquished, but neither is the diasporic philosopher willing to lose grip on a tradition that provides enrichment through phenomenological immersion. So what is it then to contemporize the ethics? What does it mean to enter into their experiential world? I would describe the process as one of textual appreciation and residing within the text. One allows their world of moral enigma and ambiguity, of unresolved ethical dilemma and cosmological allegory to shape the world, to shape the way the world shows up for one. As an act of imagination, this is a free performance. It's not that one is imprisoned within an ancient moral law. One is always capable of becoming, in reflection, aware of oneself as engaged in this immersive act, and so is able to distance oneself from the world one has entered into. Well, let me now, in this final section, return to the theme of Bhattacharya as a cosmopolitan philosopher. I do have sympathy with the idea that assimilation or accommodation is a vital and essential philosophical skill, and indeed one whose incorporation into mainstream philosophical education is of paramount importance. This is the claim that treatment of issues at the front of contemporary philosophical research in the academy will gain depth and insight if the academy's curriculum enlarges to embrace non-Western forms of philosophy. It's equally what is at stake in creative rethinkings of non-Western traditions, for example, investigating democratic political theory within a renewal of Confucian notions of government, or of human rights discourse within Buddhist Theravada. Yet I'm also sympathetic to one so far unmentioned thread in the post-independence critique of Bhattacharya. Bhattacharya's assumption that some one culture rather than another is somehow specially one's own came in for a withering philosophical deconstruction. And it's this criticism, rather than allegations of traditionalism or cultural closedness, which I think hits home. Which is representative of the Indian spirit, Professor Bhattacharya asks Dharmendra Girl. A Pandit Raj Jagannath beating about the old poetic conventions in Sanskrit at the Mughal court, or newly emerging poetry in Punjab by Guru Govind. A man of my cultural mix cannot disown one and identify wholly with Valmiki or Bharata. I would like to explore and consolidate my own worldview, not only from the Sanskrit classics, but equally from the rock etchings of central India, not only from the temples of Kanchi and Bodh Gaya, or the painting and sculpture of Ajanta, Khajuraho and Konarak, but also through the modern wonders of Amrita Shergill, M.F. Hussain, Jaimini Roy, Nandalal Bose. For me, they're mine, their images and memories have echoed long and made me the man I am. That way lies a real svarāj in ideas for us all, says Girl. Here, what's felt to be most problematic in the notion of reverence is that it implies exclusion, that one must acknowledge some one culture as one's own and accord it a special status. To say, on the other hand, that every culture or subculture is one's own is effectively to confirm that the relationship of being mine does not endow a culture with special claims over one, nor does it give one special entitlements. The idea is deliberately rendered vacuous. Well, in his incomparable manner, A.P. Rao condemns what he calls the pride of pedigree implicit in the very idea of one's own tradition. He says, tradition, whose tradition? The insidious pronoun are is invidious. The false philosophers which dominate our academies belong to their tradition. But why is it theirs and not ours? Is it because our location is not spatially contiguous with theirs? Then is it not the case that our time and our ancestors' times are not simultaneous? It is at least possible to enter into a dialogue with persons at a different location. What prospect do we have of doing the same with those who flourished when the world was young? Genetic continuity of a stock of people does not guarantee cultural continuity. Even if it does, in the case of our tradition, it should not be allowed to continue. That is precisely where the battle has to be waged. The sooner the intellectuals of this country today realize that they do not have any pride of pedigree, the better the prospect of credit-worthy progeny. And if one is overburdened with tradition, one will have to either unburden oneself or be crushed. So appeal to one's tradition is a false prospect, for no tradition is one's own. Such claims of cultural ownership certainly make sense in the context of a strategy of colonial resistance and as a method for countering the tendency towards imperialism or imperial cosmopolitanism that has been so deeply ingrained in European modernity from the 18th and 19th centuries. But in independent India, where the question is what is to be done with this new freedom, the continuation of that trope is mistimed. Girl's comment points, in fact, to a real difficulty in Bhattacharya's formulation. Bhattacharya claims that the rooted rationalist may assimilate ideas from foreign cultures if they're found on critical evaluation to deepen the ideals of his own. But here is merely assumed that one does understand those foreign ideas. Yet where could that understanding come from, unless through an immersion in the thought of the foreign culture? In practice, of course, Bhattacharya is as immersed in Western philosophy as in the Indian tradition, and feels no more tension in accessing the ideas of Kant than he does those of Shankara. Bhattacharya wrongly assumes an order of logical priority between ownership and reverence, that one cultivates reverence towards that tradition which presents itself as one's own. The correct order of priority is that a culture is one's own precisely to the extent that, and in virtue of the fact that, one accesses its concepts with an attitude of reverence. Anyone who reads Kant with as much humility and imagination as Bhattacharya does is fully entitled to claim Kant as his own. And conversely, someone who studies him merely mechanically, even if they're German, to such a person, Kant is a foreign thinker. So reverence, imagination with humility, the deepening of sentiment, inwardness, is what determines ownership. One cannot then speak of one's own intellectual world as something given, in terms of which reverence is itself to be explained. So I've been exploring the notion of cultural reverence. K C Bhattacharya said of this notion that it's that through which customary sentiments are deepened into transparent ideals, and that it's an imaginative effort to realize ideas in an attitude of humility. That reverence is a kind of subjectivity is perhaps evident. In any case, Bhattacharya explicitly says that it's inwardness. Reverence is imagining a traditional idea with humility, thereby deepening how it affects one until the thought is no longer opaque or difficult to grasp, but now is present before one as transparent. one has internalized the idea, but only because one has creatively made it one's own in the full exercise of the freedom of philosophical imagination. It's become common to use the term empathy to refer to one's ability to apprehend the mental states of others. So then what we want is an account of cultural empathy, one's ability to apprehend a tradition, to access the concepts of a culture. Empathy is not primarily a theoretical achievement. I do not have a folk theoretical model of human minds which I deploy to interpret the behavior of the person before me. The detached theoretical understanding is not what interests Bhattacharya either, and it seems not to be what's of central interest in social cognition. Prior to theoretical understanding of others as minded beings, there is, it seems, a form of intersubjective engagement in which the other's embodied actions serve to enable direct awareness of their states of mind. A phenomenological account, according to which one perceives or directly experientially accesses rather than infers the mental states of embodied others, has been suggested, and that's akin to the phenomenological interpretation of cultural reverence as experientially accessing a tradition from the inside. The alternative approach to social cognition is a simulation account, in which one simulates or inactively imagines oneself as in the mental state of another. And transferring that to the domain of culture, what the simulation account will claim is that one's reverence for a tradition consists in one's imaginative projection of oneself into a worldview. Cultural simulation does seem to be a good way to capture Bhattacharya's notion of reverence. It's an imaginative effort, it's conducted with humility, it's a way the world is experienced. One hasn't lost the motivating idea behind reverence, the idea which Bhattacharya sought to capture in his use of the term transparency, that one is not merely acquainted with, but rather involved in the culture in question. Reverence is a notion of empathetic listening to an uncultured way of thinking, an entire system of ideas and sentiments. And so understood, there can no longer be any reason to define reverence in terms of the notion of one's own tradition. Indeed, a culture in the round is one's own precisely to the extent that it engages one's intellectual empathy. So having listened empathetically to the voice of Kant, Bhattacharya carries over the idea of spontaneity when he attends to the voice of Shankara. He brings imagination in the form of association with the idea of spontaneity to humility in his appreciation of the Advaitic witness consciousness. By way of this, he arrives at an entirely new philosophical theory, the theory of self as freedom. I agree with the editors of the special issue that it's quite wrong to understand Bhattacharya as retreating into patriotism and narrow traditionalism. He's envisaged a wide, expansive, multiply rooted cosmopolitanism and has promoted it as an alternative to either traditionalism or disengagement. The cosmopolitan skill is thus a sort of intellectual binocularity. It is present whenever there are two standpoints on a single phenomenon which together add depth to understanding. Just as binocular vision enables one to see aspects of one's perceptual environment that are invisible to monocular sight, so multiply encultured attention enables one to grasp aspects of the conceptual terrain that go unobserved otherwise. Jonathan Glover, in fact, exploits this binocular metaphor when he says, I quote, that to see to the depths of people with psychiatric disorder, we need both the clear morning light of scientific empiricism, but also the strangely elongated twilight perspective, the Russian perspective of Dostoevsky. The psychiatrist who moves between these two encultured ways of attending, and here the cultures are those of science and literature, sees more deeply into the person, no doubt with greater empathy, than the clinician or the novelist alone. The same metaphor has been used of the artist Amrita Shergill, who it's said possessed a cosmopolitan lens that allows her to see subjects in their particularity, the multiplicity of categories she invokes, and her awareness of fluidity, overlap, and even interpenetration prevents her from essentializing them. This kind of cosmopolitan skill is the ability to attend to a conceptual terrain from a plurality of cultural perspectives, to alternate between them and to allow that act itself to deepen one's vision. It consists in an ability to switch between cultural orientations, philosophical creativity born in the way in which inflections from one cultural perspective give shape to and infuse encultured attention in another. And indeed, that's what we're now given to understand by the idea of assimilation or accommodation. It's a pre-reflective act and precedes any explicit comparison. So to conclude then, excuse me, reverence, I'm arguing, is empathetic intention to a way of thinking. Reverence is listening with empathy, receptiveness to encultured ways of thinking. The colonial subject is coerced into forsaking this, and Bhattacharya opposed that. He opposed too the hodgepodge cosmopolitanism that neither engages with cultures as wholes, nor with empathy and attentiveness. There's no unreserved acceptance of one's own tradition, for reverence is not uncritical immersion. And no culture is mine in any sense that implies unchosen cognitive entitlement. Through multiple attention to many systems of thought, through the manner by which one's attention to one inflects the way one attends to another, creativity of thought, svarāj and ideas arises. No thinker has been more fully a multiply rooted cosmopolitan thinker than was K C Bhattacharya, the colossal intellectual Bunyan with a trunk in German idealism and another in Advaita Vedanta. Neither hodgepodge nor have-it-all, yet wide open to innovation through cultural diversity, his reverential cosmopolitanism may indeed foretell the post-colonial or the decolonial future of philosophy. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That's a really fascinating argument, fantastic lecture. And that's all open now for discussion and questions or comments. And if you don't mind standing there.
I'll stand here, yes. Okay.
The object of the lens is attention.
Right.
Would anyone like to raise some thoughts?
It's not, it's present. Could you repeat the name of the female artist?
Amrita Shergill. Amrita Shergill, Shergil.
Yeah, it was interesting, thanks. One of the things that I suppose I was thinking of is the idea of assimilation and accommodation, but not articulation, introduced with that as part of a subliminal relationship. Because one of the things that interests me about Indian philosophy, which I'm not that familiar with, but I'm getting a bit of the hang of it, is that when you go to philosophical groups talking about what we would refer to as Western philosophy in the way I've heard you talk about it, although I'm interpreting your voice in my own way, so I don't know whether that's what you mean, but the body of work that would be produced by those moving from classical Greek through to, contemporary philosophers at the moment words have meaning, right? Which seems to be an accepted position, which gives an enormous amount of difficulty for phenomenological inquiry. If you understand phenomena in the sense of what happens after appearance, in a Kantian sense of the appearance occurring, giving you a life world, out of which you then have to articulate phenomena before you start work on the phenomena, which would give the problem of, what did you call it? Rational. Where is it? Rational.
Rooted rationalism.
Rooted rationalism, yeah, is an interesting one, because you'd have to have a speculative or dogmatic extrapolation of phenomena in order to be able to approach that, and therefore you're already using phenomena. My point being, the interesting thing to me about Indian philosophy is that it starts from where a lot of people gasp in awe when you talk about Western philosophy, because they're talking about what dare not speak its name as a spiritual relationship, i.e. the nothingness of a Hegelian bringing culture into being, which pleases an awful lot of us in phenomenology, but doesn't please an awful lot of analytical philosophers, because they prefer their world ready-made and given in an Abrahamic sense. That's quite good for them. What they don't...
Do you want to bring it to a question?
Not much, no. The Buddhist philosophy, so what I would say, I found the talk was interesting. I could grasp...
I suggest you add to try and bring it to a question.
No, it was just about, unless anybody wants me to shut up, which I will immediately. But I mean, the thing is, I found it all fascinating. The introduction for me to Indian philosophy is more than welcome. And I love the fact that it happens here. But I think there's so much more in terms of the real, I mean, getting to grips with contextual universalism. What is that? Is that saying that unless we have a context, we can't have rationality?
Okay. Do you want to make any observations?
What is your background? Because I don't know.
I'm a philosopher.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was
an architect,
which,
first of all, but then I started trying to find out about how we make sense of anything at all, really. And
what kind of philosophy do you work on?
Mind.
Yeah.
Actually, I've come at it. No, mind. My own. I mean, I've come at it from looking at phenomenology and being dissatisfied with the understanding that we have of that, and worked out that there is a problem with understanding the understanding itself, and so therefore we have to have an understanding of how we work from a subliminal relationship with accommodation, assimilation, and then articulation, which basically the nervous system is doing whether we want it to or not, and then that is providing us with phenomena, which we then have to incorporate in our lives, and then we have to actually work out a speculative or an actual dogmatic relationship with what we now work with in order to cope with life. The thing is, that takes us directly back to the idea of how we come to terms with the world in a way that has links with Buddhism, with an awful lot of spirituality, which isn't spirituality, it's merely understanding that nothingness turns into something.
Should we go back to if you have any observations of that?
Yeah, no, it's interesting. Yeah,
Okay, so should we, because I'm also aware that we haven't got that much time, so should we actually take a couple of questions? Did you?
Yeah, I just wanted to, thanks very much. I mean, this thing about critical reverence ultimately seems to be about a mode of reading texts. So that irrespective of whether you're Indian or British or German, if you read Kant in a particular way and with a particular attitude, you are performing critical
think Bhattacharya's appeal to tradition and culture that was his way of rejecting the kind of extreme cosmopolitanism that was summarised by the quotation from Rushdie, where you just take a bit of this and a bit of that, and it kind of implies, on the one hand, it sounds like a kind of great, kind of freewheeling intellectual life, but on the other hand, it doesn't respect the integrity or the unity of a system or a body of thought. And so when one speaks of the tradition or a tradition, one's trying to look at a set of ideas as a structured whole, as an integral entity, and not just kind of think that you can just kind of pick and choose one whichever bits happen to interest you. So I think that was his way of rejecting extreme cosmopolitanism.
John, can I
Yes,
ask you?
yeah.
I thought it was a really fascinating talk. Lots of things that one needs to think about slowly and to pick up. But one thing that you didn't really mention, and I think K C Bhattacharya was concerned about it, is question of language and translation. And in what language can one revere? Can one do it in a language that is not, in a sense, your first language in the same way? And I just wondered, also when he's talking about svarāj, it's partly, we have to be able to think for ourselves in our own first language, not to think in a broken language. And thinking of some of the other Asian civilizations which have struggled with this question of tradition and where it stands in relation to sort of critique of one's own tradition. In the Japanese sort of intellectual world, this long history into the 19th century of translating Western philosophy into the Japanese language and coming to think of it and revere it in their own language. Something which doesn't really happen in India. It's not just that philosophers like K C Bhattacharya are writing in English. It's that their students are also having to read the philosophers in English rather than inside. And I just wondered what you might have. You mentioned binocularity, bilinguality. Is also or multilinguality, and where that might fit into your thinking about this reverential cosmopolitanism, how essential that might be.
Yes, well, it's interesting that Bhattacharya never said that the philosophy has to be done in the original language. So he was perfectly content himself writing in English and practicing philosophy in English, and as far as I read his essay, he didn't ever feel that in itself implied a loss of authenticity. He didn't feel any need to write in Sanskrit. It would have been completely pointless because he would have had no audience for his writings.
And I would agree with that. But what about the translation of another tradition into your language in order to be able to read it in your language and then write it in whatever language you're comfortable in? And something which didn't really happen in
It's interesting why you don't get translation of philosophy into Indian vernaculars very much. You don't have a translation of Kant into Bengali, or as far as I know.
I mean, now you have Derrida and so on in Malayalam and in Bengali, but you don't. I mean, you're starting at the wrong end of the tradition, really. But it seems to me that there is something what useful to think about. I mean, why that doesn't happen, and what the significance of that might be.
Yes. Well, I think that English had already been colonised by the Indians by this point. You know, English had already been turned into a native Indian language. So that, you know, I mentioned Alke Narayan. I mean, you know, his English prose is quite different from that of any British writer. You know, but it's so. And it's the same with K C Bhattacharya. Really, I don't think he ever found writing in English to be a source of dissonance, because English there's already been 150 years of colonisation of the English language by Indians. So.
Two more.
Okay, yeah, I just wanted to ask you about this idea of reverence. It was interesting what you said about ownership being determined by reverence, understood in a certain way. You know, that's you know, it's a nice idea. So it makes sort of seems to open things up and make things accessible and so on. But I wonder if there is nevertheless a distinction between the kind of reverence one has for what is one's own, in a sort of traditional sense of one's own, and the reverence that you may have for something exotic, you know, something from another culture, because you know, when something is, we revere our ancestors partly because what they've given to us, and there's a sense of indebtedness and having been formed by it in a way that we haven't ourselves chosen, and for that reason we may feel sort of reverence and indebtedness, and a sense of not only that belongs to us, but that we belong to it. Whereas, you know, we may have reverence for something, you know, a text that was produced in a different civilization, partly because we can't really imagine how it came into being. It's just this kind of amazing thing that's part of this other tradition that, you know, might be other. So I just wonder what you think about that, and whether that's a meaningful distinction or one that should be sort of collapsed in the interest of a more cosmopolitan and sort of nomadic kind of way of thinking about these things.
Yes, but even our ancestors, we revere some of them, not others. You know, they're always
it's a blessing and a curse, isn't it?
Yes. You discover one of your ancestors was a kind of murderer, or you don't revere them, so there's still an element of choice as to which parts of your ancestry you decide to revere and to precisely to that degree take as your ancestry, and other parts you distance yourself from and feel no sense of kinship with. But it's interesting that he chose the term reverence, because it's a highly charged term, and you would know more of its nuances than I do. But it's such a kind of almost spiritual concept, and it doesn't seem initially that he wants to say we have a spiritual relationship with tradition. So why he chose exactly this notion, reverence, that term rather than any other?
It almost seems sort of unphilosophical. There's philosophers who are sort of taught not to revere anything, you know, to be sort of always on the lookout for something critical.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. Yeah.
So we've got a question there. Sarah, we'll just take, can we take, you have a question too?
I had a question.
We'll take them together.
Thank you, fascinating. I'm from an artistic perspective. I'm not a philosopher, but obviously I'm going across the board of various philosophies that inform my work. So I was interested in what you were saying about that diasporic movement and that sort of clashing in a way with what's happening now with people who are born with Asian people who are informed by what you were saying about genetic continuity is not guaranteed, cultural continuity, which is true. For the artist, one in a way dips into both, and they're both at the roots. So this individual expression, freedom of philosophy and imagination, and balancing that with reverence and philosophy is actually trying to say to us. So my
No, that's great, yes, yeah. I think there's something extremely modern about Bhattacharya's view and his recognition that there's a difficult middle path that we have to somehow find, you know, and kind of, so I began that quotation about avoiding avoiding kind of falling into the trap of either traditionalism or some kind of ultra-modernism.
Sure, and also to be able to go lateral to Tagore is very important to me.
Yeah.
So I'm really grateful that you brought in Bhattacharya into focus, because I concentrated.
Do you find, I don't know if you studied Tagore, but do you find the artistic life of Tagore to correspond with his intellectual life? Do you see a kind of a tie-in?
Well, I'm now trying to work out Indians born in India who have been educated and very deeply in education from here, whether it be law or a lot of the intellectuals were based sent over for law, and then going back and immersing themselves back in the Indian culture. And so what springboard that presents an artist with now, because we're toying with both.
Right.
Because as you were saying, that what are the roots of tradition if you had experience? I'm from an Anglo-Indian background, a father and a Greek.
Trinocularity.
Triangular philosophical intellectual.
Right, yes.
And I can begin for an artist that I'm laughing and crying about that.
Wow. Yeah. And you find that in your own work a source of creativity that you have as kind of connection with tradition, but also distance.
Discussion, but if it's in your blood when you listen to Indian rag structure, you have an inherent understanding of it. You're not quite sure why folk music from India and then the sort of Greek. Yes, I do believe that there is genetic continuity.
Yeah.
And there is independence.
Yeah. Oh, that sounds great. Yeah. Thank you.
Yes, I have a very simple question. I mean, what is philosophy?
Very simple question.
In your view. I mean, is culture really... the talk was very extremely interesting. I
Short
thought
version of the answer to this question.
it seems to be stuck the whole... I mean, Bhattacharya is obviously one of the most interesting Indian philosophers, modern Indian philosophers. Stuck in culturalist questions, and I wonder where that leads us. As I mean, this is obviously not just a historical appreciation of Bhattacharya, at least as I didn't think it was, but you wanted to say something beyond that, and without invoking hermeneutical theory from wherever, I mean, this whole theme of reverence and understanding and so on, I mean, it has been discussed in contemporary philosophy quite a bit. Anyway, what is philosophy? Why is Shankara? What questions are actually important? And what content did Bhattacharya present us with? What new idea, which is relevant for India, for the world, for whoever? And that is what I find would like to know more about.
Yes, well, it's certainly his project wasn't simply to understand. I mean, so it wasn't simply a hermeneutical project that he had of understanding other cultures. I think the intercultural philosophy movement in Germany is based on the idea that you should try to understand other cultures, or kind of model them from within your own culture or something like that. I don't think that's what he wasn't interested in simply understanding some notion. He wanted to appropriate notions in order to do creative philosophy with them. And in his own writing. I mean, this svarāj ideas is quite atypical of Bhattacharya. It's just this kind of essay that he delivered, and the text of it only came to light after his death, in fact, and so his actual published philosophical writings, edited in a thick volume called Studies in Philosophy, are extremely creative. It has an extremely creative philosophical agenda. That would be a topic for a whole other lecture, but he's certainly a brilliantly original philosopher. There's no doubt about it. And topics like the self, freedom, spontaneity, the will, these are all great constitutive. Yeah.
We'll just take two questions together and then Go ahead.
I was wondering what school of thought or what school of philosophy was Bhattacharya a part of, and who was he responding to?
And then you had a question?
Yes, thank you, Professor. Just one follow-up question from Professor Kamani's. In translation, reverence was punched into an Indian dictionary, and it's come up with adab or shraddha. What does it reverence translate to in Sanskrit or Hindi? And in which case, how does that affect Bhattacharya's rendition? And I say this because I read a particular bit by Krishna, who says that studying Indian philosophy in English takes away the spirit of philosophy or Indian philosophy. So how does that what is that dialogue like? And so,
as far as he was definitely a Kantian. Kant was his main point of reference. But then he wrote about all of he drew on all of the Indian schools. He drew on Sankhya, on Vedanta, yoga, even Jainism. He had a long essay on Jainism. So, in the Indian context, I wouldn't say that he was affiliated to any one of the standard Indian schools.
So amongst his colleagues, let's say, in the university atmosphere, if amongst his peer group, the people that he was writing to, corresponding with, did any of them have any influence on him? Or was he somebody who was working all by himself as a sort of teacher?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I don't think enough has been done to answer that question. I don't know I wouldn't be able to say. He seemed to be quite a solitary philosopher from what little I know about him. He certainly wasn't somebody who went around to conferences and giving talks all the time. He was mostly teaching at various colleges in Calcutta and doing his philosophy quite privately, from what I gather.
Can I ask you something about this intriguing question of the translation and Indian language and Sanskrit? India itself has many languages, and I wonder, has it been translated into Kannada and Tibetan?
Tibetan?
Well, Ladakh.
Ladakhi? No, not yet.
This assumption that India, Sanskrit, is kind of Hindu Brahmanic theme, I think has to be put into the
Trilinguality was quite a common feature of most educated Indians until about three decades ago. We wanted to have at least two Indian languages and one non-Indian language was quite a common feature amongst the educated elites. Sorry, just quickly, there hasn't been enough internal translation between linguistic and literary traditions or intellectual traditions in India at all. There's a national body devoted to doing this, but it's fairly clunky.
Why do you think it doesn't happen in the same way it doesn't between European languages?
Probably historically arguable, I mean,
Historically.
context and the, well, anyway.
There have been great.
Let me leave the last word to you on any.
I should reply to it. I think Krishna's stance is, to me, a very puzzling one and quite hypocritical. He says, you can't write Indian philosophy in English, but his entire writings are all in English. He didn't write a single essay in Sanskrit. Somehow he says, you can only do Indian philosophy if you write it in Sanskrit, which I just first of all, it's contradicted by his own philosophical, incredibly innovative philosophical practice, and secondly, it just doesn't make sense to me. I mean, I'm not one of these people who thinks that this kind of Whorfian thesis that ideas are embedded in languages. I think that you can translate philosophical ideas between languages without using the conceptual essence. So Krishna's stance on all this is deeply puzzling from my point of view.
How would you translate reference?
Yes, I don't know. I'll have to think about that. It's interesting he chose this term. I haven't thought about why he chose this particular term. But,
Why would Indian language be any